Welcome to session 5 of A Cup of Kabbalah. So let's talk about what makes this cup a cup. I've alluded to the idea of fullness. Is there no purpose to emptiness in Kabbalistic thought? Well, absolutely there is. The fact of the matter is that the Kabbalists would say that reality can only exist because yesh ve'ein, that there is and there isn't. It is both the positive and the negative, the existence and the non-existence simultaneously that makes reality possible. And that is particularly illustrated by this cup. So the cup, of course, this particular one's made out of plastic, whether it's ceramic or steel or whatever the glass or whatever the cup you happen to have, it is usually made out of material. Matter of fact, I can't quite imagine what it would be otherwise made out of. It can't be made out of antimatter. On the other hand, it's not really a cup, and it can't really function without the empty space. All right, it is the absence along with the presence that makes this functional, that makes things possible. And so even though I talk about Malay being filled up in Kabbalistic thought, the fact of the matter is there is a clear recognition of that sometimes we probably can be overly filled. Maybe we need to empty things out a little bit. The hendiadities of life. We value light, but darkness is indispensable. We value the idea of heaven, or however you want to understand that, the spiritual reality, but the physical reality is absolutely necessary also. So, and in fact, that's where we're going to go today. I know last time we talked, I went on for a long time, but the fact of the matter is the Sefirot requires a lot of learning. It's a big concept. It's a central concept. It's a pillar of Jewish thought and Kabbalistic thought. So it just felt right that I spend a little extra time on it. So hopefully this one will be relatively short. I'm back. And what we're going to be talking about is something fundamental to the human experience and is also used in Kabbalistic thought, and that is left and right. So if we were to imagine our Sefirot, again, there is always going to be a left side or right side, right? There's a centrality, but there's also these dimensions. You can see that in this illustration where we use, where we impose the Sefirot on the human body. And of course, human beings innately are symmetrical and have left and right sides. So look at the Hebrew Bible. When it speaks about God, it uses language that is archly anthropomorphic. God has a face, God has eyes, God has arms, hands, feet, a nose, and anthropopathic. That's a fancy word meaning having something similar to human emotions. God feels anger, God feels pleasure, God laughs. At the same time, the Bible insists that no form can become seen or representative of God. So we're presented, if not a paradox, a conundrum. And the conundrum is resolved in Talmudic thought by applying metaphors to God. The Talmud specifically says that scripture speaks in the language of men, meaning it uses language to make what would otherwise be incomprehensible comprehensible. Now, in the rationalist vein of Judaism, there is a powerful, powerful drive to make sure that we all understand that this is metaphor, that God's face, God's nose, God's feet, these are all completely metaphoric. And in the 12th century, Moreh Nevuchim, the great philosophical magnum opus of Moses Maimonides, he devotes the entire first chapter in what is a tour de force demonstration of his biblical knowledge. What he does is he takes all the anthropomorphical features of God and he goes through the Bible and he identifies every place where that same word, whether it be a nose or an eye or an arm, is used as a metaphor when not applied to God. And therefore he says, look it, when we're talking about God and talking about God's hands or God's legs or whatever, it's meant purely metaphorically. There is no concrete reality to this. It's not that God is in a human form, but that these metaphors help us grasp something through that. And so, and it continues to be the rationalist Jewish position, the one that most of us are familiar with. We are all children of Maimonides. The idea that God has no body, and therefore making these kinds of analogies, these anthropocentric analogies about God is a mistake and misleading. So, all right, everything is figurative. And so the idea that God is pure spirit has deep roots in Jewish thought. Nonetheless, Kabbalah, as part of its process of reclaiming Jewish mythic language and imagery, goes all in its devotion to the anthropomorphic expressions of God. Is it a metaphor? Absolutely. Remember, at the very top, where God is in this diagram, is the Ein Sof. There are no limits to God. There are no boundaries. There's no defining characteristics that we can insist upon, because God is not like anything else we've encountered. That being said, we need, and Kabbalah enthusiastically embraces, the idea of God's body parts, very much in the same way that it starts reusing and enriching terms like the throne of God, the chariot of God, the tree of life. All of these images are embraced and used in an encoded fashion. We're going to start with one of those, one of the key ones, and that is that Kabbalah talks about God having two dimensions. Specifically, and I don't know if this is, I think this is going to work, the right hand and the left hand of God. All right. And this is drawn directly from biblical expression. And this is combined with the rabbinic notion that sometimes God has a conflicted personality, as it were, that God ever hovers between certain kinds of attributes. And let's go back to our illustration to point this out. So one of the earliest things I called your attention to was that over here on what constitutes, in this picture, the right side of God, we have chesed, mercy, and compassion. And on the left side of our diagram, we have gevura, severity, law, predictability. And so in the Kabbalistic tradition, it will speak about the left side of God, the right side of God, that God is forever hovering between the attributes of judgment and compassion, between mercy and anger. And it follows upon a midrashic story that says God tries to create many different universes before he creates this one. He tries to make one universe based purely on justice, and he realizes it's not sustainable. If everybody gets what they deserve, things fall apart very quickly. On the other hand, he tried to create a universe built entirely upon compassion, and again, his experiment fails. If everybody gets forgiven all the time for everything, pretty soon it's chaos. And so therefore God realizes that these forces, polar forces, have to be pitted in opposition to each other. And so we talk about this idea of the left and right hand of God. Now, of course, in human beings, we generally use the metaphor of right-handedness as being strength, left-handedness being weakness. Our right hand is a righteous hand. Our left hand is sinister, which means it symbolizes human flaw and human failure. They don't go that far, but it is not surprising that when you look at the Sefirot, chesed, compassion, which is what we naturally tend to incline towards. We want compassion for ourselves all the time. That's the right hand. That's the strong hand of God. On the other hand, the left side is gevura. That is the severe nature of God, can be extended to the idea of evil in the world, being sinister. And so God's more restrictive qualities, God's more toe the line qualities, well, that's something we're not so crazy about. In human psychology, we want grace for ourselves and we want justice for everyone else, right? We want everybody to get their just desserts except us. So the Midrash plays with this and recognizes the left and the right in Kabbalistic literature. And so God is marked by a symmetry of polarities that are seeking unification and balance. And there you have it, there in the diagram. The center column is the attempt for God to bring these often contradictory attributes into harmony with one another. Not just left and right, but there will be other polarities that we'll be talking about as well. And so it is that God's presence in the world is right-handed and left-handed, attributes with balancing points to harmonize them, Tiferet, Yesod, Malchut, these forces that are the merging of these two things in the most balanced kind of way. And in time, Kabbalah will talk about the left side of God, will become known as the Sitra Achra, which is a kind of euphemistic statement, meaning the other side, the left side, which is the place where evil and the demonic emanates from within the divine order. Like all monotheistic systems, Kabbalah has to come to grips with the question of evil. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, and we'll explore what that means. However, I'm not going to plunge into that right now. It's beyond the scope of the doctrines I want you to understand. Now look, at a non-Jewish reader or student of spirituality will likely be familiar with these ideas also in other contexts. Not only does Jesus speak of being at the right hand of God, but we talk about the manus Dei, that is the hand of God, as a recurrent motif in Western art. Martin Luther even talks about the right and left hand to characterize the spiritual church in relationship to the secular church. So it's not like this is completely unique to Judaism, but what it eventually develops into is a very, very sophisticated model described in mythological terms of the idea. All right, so that interruption illustrates the famous aphorism of the sages that if you are studying Torah, which is the ultimate engagement of all human beings, and a baby cries, you need to go and attend to the baby first, then come back to Torah. In this case, it's a rabbi crying for water. But okay, back to where we were. We were talking about this, this reveling in this anthropomorphic image of God being divided. And it is a theme that comes up again and again, the ambivalent God, but also an idea that we can strengthen the hands of God. If we see too much kindness in the world, sometimes we have to set limits. If we see too much severity in the world, then we have to cultivate compassion and mercy. And so, as you can see, this diagram and these images start to become a methodology for thinking about how we operate in the world in order to be imitatio Dei, in the imitation of God's image, even as we're using imitatio hominem, imagining God in the image of human beings in order to do this. And it's actually an incredibly wise strategy, because at a certain point, abstract philosophy becomes useless to us. And the Kabbalists understand that, so they re-embrace the visual, the associative, the familiar in order to do this. So that's how the Sefirot are laid out. That's how they start to help us have a mental map of how to make a journey to get closer to God. I'm going to stop there. Thank you, everybody, for paying attention, and we'll see you next time.